By now it was almost noon when their breakfast broke up, breakfast at Vivian's. Uh, and they went their separate ways. Tira had went back to the city, and of course Vivian stayed there, and then Violet and Elaine they drove back, and Violet chose to drive, and she chose to drive along the same way that they'd come, estimating or guessing at what route Lance would take. It was pretty obvious, and so they'd drive along there nice and slow, just in case he had any trouble. They'd kind of back him up, and they drove along, and for the first 10 or 15 minutes, nobody really neither one of them said much, because there was just so much to think about from Vivian, especially Vivian's story. And Elaine said, what a character she is. And Elaine or Violet had to agree. Then after a while, surprisingly, Elaine broached a subject. She said, Jima, would you tell me more about Wedge? You guys were really close, weren't you? And Violet said, oh yeah, we really were. Did you ever think of marrying him? And at that, Violet said, I should probably tell you this story. So she pulled off. It was lots of places to pull off, and she pulled off, and she said there were three of us that were the closest of friends. I was married before. I married your grandfather. I was married to a man named Jules Truffaut. For a while I was Violet Elaine Truffaut. That was my name for a short time. Well, Jules, my first husband, he and I and Wedge were almost inseparable in high school. We skied together a couple whole winters. I mean, we were just kind of always together, and we didn't we sort of did date in a way, because we just went to the same social events. Now, Jules was he was from his dad was French Canadian. That's why that name Truffaut, and he was a heck of a hockey player. He went to Dartmouth, and so Wedge went to Harvard, and Jules went to Dartmouth, but they still stayed friends. And then when we went into the Peace Corps, there were those 3 years after we graduated. Those 3 years that we didn't see Jules. Wedge and I were in the same program. But then when we got out of the Peace Corps, we got together again, and we actually spent a winter living in the same. It was my father's lake house, we called it, on Lake Sunapee, not that far from Dartmouth. We spent a winter there. Boy, it was a hard winter. I mean, it was all we could do to stay warm that winter. But an odd thing had happened. You almost have to understand the times to understand how this could have happened. Both Jules and Wedge decided that they didn't want to go with the career that they were being prepared for. I mean, Jules was on his way with a Dartmouth degree and on his way to law school. Or actually, after Peace Corps, he'd actually been in law school. And Wedge, who knows what he was going to do, but with that Harvard diploma, he could have had a good job, or a well-paying job. But they both decided they wanted to be carpenters. They didn't want that academic life. They wanted to be carpenters. It was the spirit of the time. This was 1973 and 74. maybe someday, I doubt if you've studied it yet, but if you ever study that time, it's sometimes called the Great Recession. There was the Arab oil embargo. The war in Vietnam had just divided this country so much and left young people like us uh, bitter against the government because of what the U.S. government had asked us to do. It was a hard time, and it was, well, it's hard to explain. You maybe someday you'll research it. But anyway, we were living in that, and the two of them were happy with being carpenters, and I was still working on my occupational therapy degree. But boy, money was tight. It was rough, and then Wedge got laid off. Well, Jules didn't. Jules ended up staying there, but Wedge got laid off. It was in the early spring. That would have been 1974. And instead of just sitting around waiting until the economy picked up, he couldn't take it anymore. He announced he was going to Pennsylvania. He was going to the family farm. It wasn't settled. It was his parents and his aunt and uncle. They were fighting over it, and so in a way he was going to just go right into the middle of a war, of kind of a firestorm. But he was going to go plop himself down there, and that's where he was going to be. So he went, and in a way you might say that was his first love, more so than me or Jules. I mean, the three of us really were closer than you can probably imagine. But he said he was going to go, but he wanted us to go with him. His hope was that he could get himself established there a little bit, and because he had skills as a carpenter now, and Jules did too, and he thought we'd join him. That was his big hope, but it wasn't going to happen, and so it wasn't too long after that I married Jules. Now here Elaine interrupted, and she said, "Is that what happened? That the two of you had this great falling out, that you've never even spoken about Wedge before?"